Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. It's good to see you all here to join our conversation on strengthening transatlantic security through democratic resilience. Thank you for coming. Thanks also to Alice Young-Basura back there, Executive Director of the International Peace Museum, and her entire team for hosting us so graciously and for the work they've done on exhibiting NATO and Dayton Peace Accord themes so thoughtfully. I'm Joe Brinker. I'm the Policy Fellow for Democratic Resilience at NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Brussels. I'll be your moderator today. It's particularly gratifying for me to be here in Dayton because I'm originally from Cincinnati and I have lots of family here in Dayton, so it's a bit of a homecoming. I got a call from my mom on Thursday. She was very excited. She had seen me on the local news, so that was fun. Let me take a moment now to introduce you to our esteemed panelists. You do not come to us today with much background on security or democratic resilience. Let me assure you that we could not have a stronger panel than the one we have with us today. Before I introduce them, I should emphasize that in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of their full biographies and lists of accomplishments. There is far more to note in their backgrounds than what I'm about to summarize, and I invite everyone to look into them when you get a chance. First, I want to introduce Marcos Perestrello. Most importantly for me and for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Marcos serves as our president. And he brings to this role a mountain of experience. He is currently vice president of the Portuguese Assembly, and he has held a host of senior roles in service to his country, including serving as the Secretary of State for National Defense. We also have Kathleen McInnis. She is director of the Smart Women, Smart Power Initiative and a senior fellow in the Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, also known as CSIS. She brings to our conversation today decades of experience on NATO and security matters, both in the US and UK, and with a variety of think tanks. And finally, we are fortunate to have with us today Tino Cuéllar, president of the Carnegie Endowment of Peace. The institution he leads is a vital resource on matters of peace, security, and democracy. He's a former justice of the Supreme Court of California, served 3 US presidential administrations at the White House and in federal agencies, and was the Stanley Morrison Professor at Stanford University. Importantly, for this conversation, he can bring a pretty comprehensive and unique angle that the others on the panel might not necessarily cover. Before I jump into the questions, let me set up the topic for you a bit, including how I have lived it personally over the years. My position at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is a new one. It reflects the high emphasis our institution places on assuring that NATO reinforces its founding and long-standing commitments to defend democracies, most tangibly through the establishment of a Center for Democratic Resilience, which you will soon hear more about. I spent a few decades promoting democracy in dozens of countries throughout the world with organizations like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the UN, and USAID. From the beginning of my career, which started around the collapse of both the Soviet bloc and Yugoslavia, I recognized that on many levels our democracy work could not be separated from security questions. Effectively, the more successful we were at building democracies, the safer we would all be. And in many of the places I went, particularly Bosnia, the key theme of our Dayton session, and other Balkan countries like Kosovo and present-day North Macedonia, I found myself working alongside NATO and saw firsthand that NATO has a proud record of providing vital logistical, operational, and other support to democratic processes when it is requested. In some cases, NATO is the only entity on the ground with the resources to provide such assistance. So on this operational level and on other important strategic, structural, and even philosophical levels, NATO, not just as a military alliance, but also as a political one, is going to play important roles on democracy. And in the face of this fact, it needs to make sure it is always prepared as an institution to play those roles to the best of its potential. Now for the panel. I'm going to start with a question for you, Marcos. Why has the NATO Parliamentary Assembly consistently advocated for NATO to remain true to its democratic principles and foundations, and for the establishment of a Center for Democratic Resilience within NATO headquarters?
Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you for putting together this event. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Tino, for joining us. It is a huge pleasure to be here with you. It's really an honor. Thank you to Dayton for the hospitality that gives name to the famous Midwest warm hospitality. Thank you to the city, to the people of the city, and to the Peace Museum that is welcoming us. Thank you, Alice, for the nice tour you provided us before. It is an immense pleasure to be here with us. This city that gave name to the important Dayton Accords that put an end to the war in the Western Balkans, the most bloody war that Europe knew since the Second World War, is an image, a clear image of how important is to agree on peace, but also important is to work on the building of the institutions that, after the peace being agreed, can be essential to that peace to last. And on the days we live in, that is, when we are trying to put an end to another war in Europe, it is important to have that present. We need to agree on peace, and we need to agree on strong conditions to maintain that peace. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly has long understood that the protection of democracy is not secondary value to NATO. It is at its core. I come from a country, Portugal, which is a founder of NATO. And at the time NATO was founded, we are not a democracy. We were the only country at NATO, among the founders of NATO, that were not a democracy. And we know very well the difference of what we did to NATO, what we did with NATO, what we expected from NATO, and what NATO expected from us when we were not a democracy. Everything was around 9 small islands in the middle of the Atlantic called Azores. And what we expected from NATO and what NATO expected for us after we became a democracy in 1974, by the way, with a relevant support of the United States of America. Not everybody in the United States of America, not Kissinger, but a relevant part of the US-American administration that believed that it was possible to implement a democratic state in Portugal. And that was very important, and it's something that we Portuguese should never forget as a democratic country today. The way how the NATO Parliamentary Assembly looked at the democratic values it's a deeply felt conviction, and has been always a driving factor for the establishment of the Assembly, whose 70th anniversary we celebrate this year. As parliamentarians, all of us are on the front line of the struggle to defend the democratic values, and NATO must be too. And the NATO Parliamentary Assembly must be even more than NATO. This is why this Assembly continues to press NATO for the establishment of a Center for Democratic Resilience at NATO headquarters. This was a life struggle of our late President Jerry Connolly that passed away this week. We will feel in the future how his participation was important on the construction of this strong advocation for the establishment of a center of democratic resilience in NATO's headquarters. And why? Why? Because today more than ever, autocrats are closing ranks. And so we must also do that. Also we must close, Democrats need to close our ranks. We must increase our democratic resilience and better counter their hybrid warfare and their challenges to the rules-based international order, attacking our internal democracies from the outside. And we must help our partners, not only the members, but also our partners, NATO partners, NATO Parliamentary Assembly partners, many countries that are also victims for the interference of autocrats undermining their democracy, their democracies and their democratic values. That is the importance of a center of democratic resilience that we need to establish at the NATO headquarters. The logic behind our proposal has always been simple: to put into action the commitments to democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law contained in the Washington Treaty. Because the Washington Treaty advocates these principles, advocates these values. And democratic resilience begins at home, at our countries, but it cannot end it there. And democracy must be considered, consistently defended with ideas, with vigilance, and shared responsibility, but also with collective structural and consistent responses. As the lady that was at the other room at the museum mentioned, the line from hate speech to violence is a straight line. It's a continuous line. There you are. But I was not seeing you, sorry. Yeah. It's a straight line, but it's a line that takes time to be fully percorrida, fully achieved. So we have some time to intervene, and we are seeing it happening. So we need to intervene. We need to take our time to intervene, cutting that line, ending the hate speech, and on this way avoid future violence. And that's a role that democracies need to fulfill. The Center for Democratic Resilience that we advocate to be established in the NATO headquarters is to fill a structural gap. There's a gap on the defense of democratic values at NATO, and we need to fulfill that gap. There is President Connolly had a very funny expression. I don't know which of you met him, but he was a man of irony, and he had a very funny expression, something like, when you get into that space, Star Wars space that is the NATO headquarters. I don't know if you know the headquarters of NATO, but it's an amazing building. And he used to say, you get into that Star Wars spaceship, and you don't find a broom closet about democracy. That was a very ironic expression from President Connolly, and because there is no dedicated entity tasked with promoting or supporting democratic governance among allies or assisting partners on these efforts, and this gap needs to be filled. This center would function as a resource and a facilitator. It would provide voluntary assistance to allies and to partners who wish to strengthen their democratic institutions. It would also bring consistency and coherence to the democracy support. NATO is asked to provide on emerging democracies at times. This is working fine. Because many times countries that face problems need assistance on the construction of their democratic institutions. We are seeing that now in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for instance. They need support on that because things are not running well. And we cannot be reassured with the signature of the accords 30 years ago. It has been 30 years of consistent work that needs to be continued, and those are, on my point of view, the most relevant concerns that should lead us to persist on the idea of create at the NATO headquarters a Center for Democratic Resilience, able to guarantee that we defend ourselves for the attacks, namely hybrid attacks and disinformation, that are undermining our democracies, and help our partners to build stronger democracies for their own. Thank you, Joe.
Great. Thank you, Marcos. So that's, I think, a great overview of sort of how the NATO Parliamentary Assembly sees this topic. But now I want to widen the aperture a bit and ask Kathleen the next question, which is, how would you define democratic resilience writ large?
Well, first, thank you for this opportunity to be here on this panel, and thank you to the Peace Museum here in Dayton for hosting us, and frankly reminding us of what the NATO alliance is actually all about. It is about preserving peace for our publics, the billion people that live in NATO territories. We do a lot of defense preparation. We do a lot of work every single day to try to make sure that war does not break out in our territories ever again. Because of all places, this institution knows the horrors of war. So I'm very grateful that we're able to have this conversation here. And at the heart of it, the heart of what we're doing is about democracy and democratic resilience, right? When we think about democracy, I think a lot of folks just tend to think, well, it's elections and election security. That's true, but it's wave tops, right? Democratic resilience is a reflection of an entire ocean, an ecosystem of actors and civil society and narratives and stories and communities that come together and work together to find common democratic solutions to issues that are facing us. This is not something that is easily achieved, obviously, right? And frankly, I think we're getting a little bit worse at it. Like social media, the algorithms are a hellscape, right? So it's getting harder and harder to have those kinds of conversations to keep our democratic conversations going. So when we think about democratic resilience, we're talking about building the fabric, this ecosystem of community that allows us to withstand shocks and to preserve peace. Yeah, I mean, it's a very simple but highly complex thing that to accomplish. And just to build on to a point that you made, you can never take your hand off the wheel, right? Democratic resilience is never something that's done. We never achieve it, right? We always work at it. We always strive for it. We will always be able to be better. And that's what this institution, NATO, and that's what this Peace Museum is just inspiring in me, that remembering that we got to work at it every single day. So thank you for that.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. Now a question for Tino. From your experience in public service and the judiciary, what lessons can NATO draw in promoting the rule of law and democratic governance during uncertain times?
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here too. I was moved actually walking through the museum and seeing some of the reminders of what happened here 30 years ago. Right, Pat? At the end of the day, we Americans, I think, are proud of our country not only because of how it responds to its own people, but also because of what it can do and what it's done in the world. And peace is a gift, and it's hard fought in many ways, ironically, and it requires not only ideas, but a great deal of will and determination. To your question, all of us who live in a country like the United States understand a couple things. We understand, for example, that democracy depends not only on a charter that's written down, our set of rules in our Constitution, but also on the things that you and I do every single day. We show up for jury service. We vote in elections. It's our right, not something we're compelled to do, but it's a right. It's a responsibility. We stay reasonably informed about what's going on in the world. When I think about the broader lessons and how that set of principles applies to how our court system works, how our elections work, how our federalism works, and applied to NATO, I come up with just 3 simple ideas that I think really tie together with what we've heard so far with my co-panelists that I'm very honored to be here with. The first one is that if you look at human history, the countries that tend to care the most about what is going to happen to their soldiers, to their military, are democracies. Because a leader cannot simply say, I don't care what the losses are going to be. My country has an interest in winning this war, and it's going to be meat grinder, and there are going to be thousands and thousands more of you that are going to go to the front lines. And if that sounds a little familiar given current events, it's not an accident. So protection of our own military, the ability to work together with other countries for a set of nations that have a democratic ideal and actually care very deeply about what happens to the military. That's one, protection. Second, learning. Democracy is complicated. This is one thing you learn as you study the courts, look at elections, and at the end of the day, we've got a whole family of democracies in NATO. We've got some presidential systems like in the US, we've got semi-presidential republics like France, we've got parliamentary systems. The opportunity to create a community of practice. How do you consult the public? How do you reconcile what a member of the public thinks and connect that to what lawyers, what expert scientists think without having them be too insulated from public will? That is a constant challenge, has to be reinvented over time. Also, in the kind of learning bucket, how do you tell the story of a strategic alliance that has goals that are very real, protecting ourselves and our militaries, but it can be very abstract to the public and make them real to people? The last point I would make is the word empathy, which is a strange word because it seems very abstract, but this is what I mean. Leaders decide, to some extent with their national interest in mind, but the ideals of an alliance have to be translated into the local context. All the parliamentarians that are here at Dayton right now, they carry that task in particular, with them on their shoulders, and figuring out how we can have some understanding that these strategic goals involving things like military spending have to be translated to a local context, how we have to decode the rhetoric sometimes, understand what's really behind it, pay attention to what the public is telling us. That is also something that has to unite NATO as an ideal that all of us share.
Thank you. That was really thought-provoking. I maybe want to follow up on a couple things you said there because they pertain to some of the other things we've been talking about. First, when you're talking about learning, and creating a community of practice. This is something we've been thinking about a lot, particularly with respect to the Center for Democratic Resilience, and that is in order for any entity to carry out an objective effectively, you need to have some kind of central guiding force, and it's better if you don't do it ad hoc. And this is particularly important.
I don't mean to interrupt. You just said force, and he said Star Wars. I just want to point that out.
Good, touche. So basically, when
I think there is no version from their economy.
if any of us start making things levitate, then the force is strong with us for sure. So consistency is important for lots of endeavors, but it's particularly important for resilience, and it's particularly important for democracy. What you were talking about, Kathleen, the need to constantly work at it. Democracy is not a state, it's a process. And so that's part of why we advocate for a Center for Democratic Resilience, because we want NATO to be effective in its relationships and responsibilities on democracy. And it can do that best through a center that provides that kind of consistency, that captures lessons learned, that builds institutional memory. So I think that's really important. I think I'll leave it at that, because I want to make sure we want to leave time for questions if people have questions from the audience. So I do want to follow up with a couple other questions first. A question again for Marcos. How has the war in Ukraine reinforced the urgency for NATO to establish a Center for Democratic Resilience?
Well, the war on Ukraine started because Russia didn't want Ukraine to become a true democracy, to decide for her own, to freely choose her leaders, to freely choose their path in direction to Europe, in direction to NATO. And so I would say that the need of strong democracies able to advocate through democratic values, which, as you very well mentioned, is much more than elect the people that are going to govern us, to rule us. It's to guarantee that the judiciary is separated from the political branch, is to guarantee that the law is respected, it's to guarantee that the majority doesn't crash the minorities, is to let people choose to tolerate others. There are endless requisites for democracy than just elect the rulers, and that is what was happening in Ukraine. They were trying to choose a path, and that will to choose something different, something related to democracy, led Russia to the aggression that brings us here today.
Do you want to jump in on this?
Yes. I wanted to pull on a point that you made in your opening answer, which was the line between hate speech and violence, right? I mean, when we look at what's happened with Russia and Ukraine, Russia had an active information warfare campaign to basically depict Ukrainians as Nazis, and to show that the Ukrainian people should not exist. It's a genocide. It is a genocide now. There have been at least 20,000 children abducted and taken to Russia. At least. There have been at least 84,000 war crimes, heinous war crimes, committed by Russian soldiers against Ukrainians. And that's just what's been documented. Those are only the people that can come forward and face the experience and tell it to the lawyers who can capture this stuff. It is a brutal war. And so when we're here in this Peace Institute, I think it's also incumbent upon us to acknowledge that peace has to be created on the appropriate foundations. A ceasefire without appropriate consideration for the Ukrainian side is essentially telling Ukraine it will no longer exist. It is to allow a genocide to occur. And so these are very, we had, you know, this memory of the Balkans and Sarajevo. Here in this Peace Museum, we've seen these horrors. They're happening now. So yeah, we need to think about that as we think about a peace settlement.
I'm going to follow the same, but just building on what you just shared, the same framework of protection, learning, and empathy. Let's start with learning. So one of the ways that NATO members can and should learn from each other is to think about the challenge of information and an informed public and disinformation, foreign malign influence in the information ecosystem, because the process of deliberating about what NATO should do partly plays out at the level of citizens and at the level of people trying to decode information. And what are the right ways of balancing freedom of expression with a strategic goal to let the public be shielded from foreign malign influence, I think is a NATO-wide challenge. That's one. In terms of protection, the reality is that 20 years ago, actually even 30 years ago when we did the Right Path stuff and Dayton Accords, it looked like the world was headed towards less geopolitical fragmentation, more international cooperation, less great power competition. The reality is that the war with Ukraine is the culmination of a very terrible revenge of geopolitics, in a sense, that is reminding us that the world is pulling apart. So some of what NATO will have to deal with is not just the training, the deterrence, the preparation. It's also the reality of overflights over its territory, questions where one or another geopolitical adversary is deliberately trying to test Article 5. Is there going to be reaction? That's on the protection side. On the empathy side, I think that reality of protection in a geopolitically fragmented world does mean that many members of the public in NATO countries will be legitimately concerned about whether they want to truly be fighting a war for a country that's far away. And that, to my mind, highlights the importance of parliamentarians, because they are the ones that have to renew the relevance of Article 5 for every generation and not just say, this was signed a generation, 2 generations ago, but why does this matter to a community like this one, Dayton, Ohio, or Massachusetts, or Tennessee, or California right now?
Can't take our hand off that wheel either.
I thought you were going to jump in.
Just again, getting back to the point about this Center for Democratic Resilience. Again, like I love this proposal that you put forward for a variety of reasons, but to include, you know, having a space where we can deliberately focus on these issues of democratic resilience, but also, if you look at the Treaty of Washington, the treaty that founded NATO in 1949, Article 2 is all about this, right? Article 2 is about advancing and protecting democracies and promoting economic interdependence amongst allies, right? So when we talk about this Center for Democratic Resilience, I'm kind of actually mystified as to why it doesn't already exist, because we've got the treaty language and authority to do it.
And it's being reinforced most recently in the NATO strategic concept of 2022.
But this whole set of questions, it's why we fight. It's why the alliance exists. It's so that we can have democracies, because the only way to preserve our democracies is together.
Tino, I want to come with another question for you. What unique strengths does NATO bring to the global effort to defend democracy that complement rather than duplicate the work of other institutions?
Well, let's start with the headquarters. It does look a little bit like a spaceship from Star Wars. I was actually just there on Monday. How many of you have seen the headquarters, at least in a picture? Look it up on your phone. Not right this minute, but after we finish. It really is a dramatic achievement. And I should add, it sounds like a digression, but to your point, for many, many years, NATO was across the street from where it is now in what was supposed to be temporary, but it was in the temporary headquarters for many decades. And to me, it's sort of symbolic, to your point about what strength NATO brings, to go from a temporary building to one that is supposed to be there pretty much forever, and it really looks it that way. It's it's sort of big and permanent. So one thing NATO brings to this discussion is that it can plan ahead over time. It's not just thinking about short-term electoral cycles or budget cycles, but it can and should be asking, how is emerging technology going to change the way our adversaries, or Russia, might plan a particular strategy militarily? I think another thing that it brings is actual practice. It's one thing to have a set of diplomats talking about coming together and mutual protection. It's another thing to have decades of experience actually with intermingled training, planning together, command and control, which can inform a lot of thoughtful judgments. And ideally, a third thing it brings is a voice where the world hears that democracy and strength, military strength, can coexist. The two can go together. And the idea that this is a truly democratic alliance doesn't mean that it's weak or unprepared.
Great, thanks. It makes me think also of maybe a couple comparisons that might be interesting. So another thing about resilience is it's good with any kind of resilient approach if you have backups, if you have alternative options. For example, with COVID, the whole global supply chain suddenly experienced the vulnerability that was there to sort of just-in-time management of logistics and manufacturing and things like that. And when you don't have a plan B, things jam up pretty quickly. And I've experienced in my own career something similar in the world of defense and diplomacy, in that when there are shocks, if there are multiple institutions that sort of overlap each other a bit, when one of them suddenly is really struggling, another one can often jump in and pick up some of that slack. And so in the world of democracy, while there are other entities that are the primary drivers of democracy promotion, such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, sometimes the United Nations, sometimes it's the EU. There are other entities out there like the Organization for American States. Those entities tend to really roll up their sleeves at times and get in the weeds on democracy. The organization I used to work for, USAID, also did a lot of work in that space. They just went down, right? So I've seen, as they've gone down, the value of having other entities that are in this space that can coordinate with each other. And I think that's something to consider when you're talking about NATO. We need to be tied into those structures because we can contribute. We have unique resources to bring, particularly when things get bumpy. I think with that, it would be a good time to open up for questions and answers from the audience. If anyone, just simple raise of hands, and we'll take first come, first serve. Got a question in the back there at the bar. By the way, there is a bar back there, so please take advantage of that after the conversation. Not during, but
yeah, you'll need it after. Data tells us that countries with more women in leadership, especially in the areas of government, democracy, and security, experience lower levels of conflict, violence, and war. Within the NATO context, a lot of the member states differ in significantly in how they promote women in these roles. How do these disparities impact the cohesion of the alliance? And do you see any national models leading the way for how women in leadership should be protected?
Thank you for that question, because it points to the crucial roles that women play in our security institutions and in our governments overall. I am the director of the Smart Women, Smart Power initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And one of the things that we have drilled down pretty deeply on is the no-kidding contributions that women have made to the national security and international affairs spaces. And I've now done, I want to say around 150 interviews with different women, and to understand exactly what they brought to the table in these critical decision-making points in history. And we found a number of things, to include organizations risk not having sufficient intelligence about the environments they're operating in if you don't have women. because women tend to talk to women. And if you don't have women in decision-making spaces, you are probably going to be missing out on 50% of the population that you're trying to work with. Second, we've also we did a study on gender and authoritarians, right? So this is fascinating to me, but our authoritarian adversaries, Russia, China, North Korea, to some extent Iran, have been essentially pretty close to gender apartheid policies. They double down on aggressively misogynistic rhetoric. They are advocating women taking traditional roles, advancing this notion of this golden age where women were having babies. I think in Russia they're encouraged to have 8 babies now. What we noticed, though, over time is that women's groups are powerful bulwarks for democracy and can be the first chink in the armor, the first crack in the glass when it comes to taking down these regimes. So it occurs to me, if our authoritarian adversaries are running these gender-based playbooks against their own populations and ours in the information warfare campaigns they're waging against us, as strategists, we really ought to be paying very close attention to how they're doing that, and then working with women's groups. Neither Russia nor China care about women, peace, and security. They have ceded 51% of the human terrain around the world to us as democracies. Let's go.
That's fantastic. Great. Thank you, Kathleen. That's awesome. There's a question back there.
Several years ago, I read there are standards for democracy, and America fell below those standards several times in the last 10 years. How can NATO hold America's feet to the fire as it relates to democracies and those standards? You know, one was peaceful transition of government, fair elections. There are at least 7 or 8. How can NATO hold America to those standards?
I think that's well beyond NATO capabilities. Well, what I can say about that, it's NATO is a military alliance, but it's more than that. It's not just a military alliance. It's a military alliance based on democratic principles. All the countries, all NATO members are democracies. Some of these democracies have problems. None of these democracies is a perfect democracy. What we can and we should do, and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, it is a privileged organization, a privileged place to do it, is to share our best practice, the best practices of each one of our democracies, of our countries, and try to convince others to adopt them. But perfection, I think it's far from any of the democracies that are members of NATO. But it's something that we would like to seek for.
This is a popular question. So
I just want to add a point. It's interesting that you brought this up because in my view, it is important that there be standards that can be used to get a better sense of how all democracies are working, including NATO members. I would just point out that in the ones that I've seen, there are often indices that still recognize that the U.S. is very much in the democracy territory, but that highlight that relative to other countries, there are some things we do better here, some things we do less well, and it changes a bit over time. I think one good thing about that frame is that it will keep us honest to make sure that we are looking hard at where and how we can improve our democracy over time. It certainly works better now than it did 150 years ago, I will say. But I will highlight one important difference across NATO members that is, to my mind, worth noting, and that is some NATO members are federations and others are not. So some are unitary governments. So for example, the UK is a collection of countries, but there's not the federal structure that there is in the United States. My own view is that one important ingredient in the American democratic tradition is that federalism structure. that Ohio and Iowa and California and Massachusetts and Tennessee are not all going to be run by the same party or the same way very often. And I think that is a source of strength. And I just highlight that because there are definitely places where the U.S. can learn from other countries, but also maybe the U.S. can have something.
Tino, but I don't know the exact study of the exact standards that the gentleman was referring to, but there are certain standards that has to do, for instance, with the kind of public services that are provided to the people. Do you have health care? Do you not have health care? How does social security function? How is education, public education, available to everybody? How is women health treated? There's an amount of standards that that show us clearly that democracy is not just elections. It's much more than that.
That's a great point.
I'll also just jump in real quick and come back to the reflection again that okay, just one quick point on that. It's that democracy is a progress and is a process, and it has ups and downs. And we're all here today. We're all here talking about democracy, and I think it's important to note, for example, that we're here today in part thanks to the enormous efforts of your representative, Mike Turner, and his partner on the other side of the aisle, Jerry Connolly, Representative Connolly, who sadly passed away just a few days ago, who was extremely instrumental in pushing for this, for our commitment to democratic resilience. And so we're all here, all these parliamentarians from all over the alliance, talking about democracy. There might be challenges here, there are challenges in other countries, but the process continues. So there's a question back there.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, you mentioned earlier the importance of maintaining the integrity of these democratic structures rather than specifically about elections. I was wondering, with the new Center for Democratic Resilience, what kind of strategies would you use to kind of allow countries to be able to maintain these structures? Because a lot of the time, sometimes we aren't following our own like democratic systems.
Maybe I can give you an example. We have, I think we didn't mention yet a specific aspect that it's without what there's no democracy. That it's free press, freedom of press. We need freedom of press to have a true democracy. And that also messes with the standards, by the way. In a big country, it's possible to have several newspapers, several TV channels, several radio stations. In a small country, maybe it's more hard to have such a variety of newspapers, TVs, and radios. And so the democratic standards on that country probably will be affected by that particular issue. One of the aspects that the Center for Democratic Resilience could detect was the attempt of external interference on the freedom of expression, on malign information, on disinformation. It would be a concrete aspect. To give you one example that could be at the core of a Center of Democratic Resilience. We saw in Europe in the last years several elections, some referendums affected by external influence, identified as Russian influence, that affected the results of the elections or the referendum. Many people believe that the Brexit was the result of external interference and disinformation, and that result.
Hi. How does NATO address the concerns of communities that promote peace through nonviolence and are skeptical of military intervention as a path to achieving peace? It's open to anyone.
Those protesters are why we're here. in the community. I mean, that's why we're here. The ability to express themselves, the ability to register their concerns. Absolutely. We need our publics to really hold us to account on whether or not we are using force wisely, whether we are doing so for just reasons. That is a part of the process that we are encouraging. So yes, this is great.
I mean, if I could just add to that, complementary to some of what you just said, if you look at Article 5, it does say, all right, an attack on one is an attack on all. And that seems like something that expands the purview of military conflict in a way. But there are two nuances. The first one is that it has a deterrent effect. So ideally, it limits the extent to which one or another country just gets picked off in war after war. That's important. Second, particularly in a community of democratic nations, they expect a degree of consultation and deliberation when and if NATO itself is ever to act. And I think it's telling that Article 5 was never actually activated until the 9/11 attacks, which tells you something about how, for communities that do care about peace and care about not rushing into war, an alliance that is consultative and careful and thoughtful can actually be a key ingredient.
We're living that right now. You have one final question.
I was wondering how important you feel it is for organizations like the International Peace Museum for the resilience of democracy.
Well, we can't quite be here and say it's not that important, to be clear. That would require a lot of diplomacy. But if I could just speak from the heart for a moment, we walked in here and saw, among other things, a uniform that somebody who was conscripted into the Bosnian Serb army had to wear. We saw some of the objects that were left behind in the Dayton discussions here that had, at the time, for the participants who were bleary-eyed after days and days of negotiation, maybe not that much meaning, but we look at them now 30 years later and can't help but be inspired about what people can accomplish if they put their mind to it as an alternative to war. So I would say, even just as somebody who's in this milieu a little bit, I find that it's a powerful shot in the arm, and I want to bring my kids here someday.
Institutions like this are essential, right? It's the way we remember. And these are the, again, there's an active hot war in Europe right now. Ukrainians are dying right now. And the questions that plagued us 30 years ago are very much alive right now. The books behind us are all about how do we wage peace. That's an incredible contribution for which we're grateful. But back to the other question about trust in the military. Should military be involved in peace? I mean, is this really a good use of policy? There's the old Tolstoy quote. You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. We must be prepared for that. And that is the hard complexity of the world in which we are living.
You know why Putin invaded Ukraine? Because he thought that in 2 weeks he could be in Kyiv and install there a puppet regime. So he thought that Ukraine was weak. That's why he invaded. Yesterday, General Clark told the conversation he had with Milosevic in the Bosnian War, when they stopped the war, and Milosevic confessed, how could we handle with NATO? How could we handle with all that power? That's why the war stopped, because on the other side there was a strong force that demanded the war to stop. There's no peace without strength.
Great. That's a great point to end on, I think, Marcos. And we've unfortunately run out of time. So I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who came out today and gave us some attention to this important topic. And thank you for all your questions. And